Good evening, everybody. Welcome. So lovely to see so many hundreds of people already here for this very special event this evening with my dear friend Nipun Mehta. Nipun, it's absolutely lovely to see you again, and thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Likewise, I'm so happy to be here.
And there were still many joining us, and I'm, as always, so delighted to see people sort of welcoming each other from all around the world. It really is a global community we've got to join us for this conversation this evening, which we've called Generous Happiness. And obviously lots to explore in your work and this concept of generosity and how it links to our great passion with creating a happier world. So obviously really looking forward to a conversation between the two of us. I'll just give the audience a quick overview of the plan. So Nipun and I will be having a sort of conversation through a few different themes for about half an hour or so. And then we're very much looking forward to bringing in some questions from you, the audience. So please do use the Q&A function on Zoom if you'd like to ask Nipun a question. We probably won't have time to do all of them, but we'll certainly use lots of those questions. And I'm delighted to say Nipun also has some interactive ideas in store for us to participate in during the session as well, some questions for us to think about. So looking forward to that. So without further ado, let's dive into this topic. And Nipun, I think I know you well, and many in our community will have seen your inspiring work, but perhaps for those who don't know the story as well, it would be lovely if you could share a bit about your own journey and this connection you have with generosity and what's led you there and what this really means to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mark, for organizing this and for all the values that UN Actions for Happiness stand for. My personal journey, I would say, if I had to put it into one core shift, it would be from greed to generosity. That I grew up in the Silicon Valley, in the heart of the Silicon Valley, and especially in the late 90s when I was getting out of college, there was this whole .com phenomena. And there was just this immense greed. And I looked at that greed and I saw that there were a lot of, creative elements, a lot of elements of pushing the status quo beyond its comfort zone. But it was driven by this, this insatiable greed that to me felt a bit out of whack. And so I said, if not greed, then what is going to be moving, moving me, moving the needle for society? And for me, I found the answer in generosity. So we started by doing just small acts of love, small acts of kindness, small acts of service. And those small acts ended up adding together, coming together in new formations, created service space, and then from one project to another to a third. And, here we are 20 years later, still not tired, still feeling enthusiastic and hopeful. So I feel very grateful to have had the privilege of encountering service at such a young age and actually having the conditions ripen where I could just dive right in.
Well, I'm love to dive into that more in our conversation. I wondered if maybe we could just pick one example of a kindness themed or a service themed project that's been at the heart of your work. I always love the story of Karma Kitchen, which was one of your initiatives, but I know there were so many. Could you bring this to life with one particular example of a project that you guys and the people you collaborated with conceived and has really made a difference?
Yeah, you mentioned Karma Kitchen, and the idea really is when we consider small acts of service or small acts of kindness, we tend to sort of think, oh, that doesn't really matter. But actually creates a very phenomenal nonlinear effect. And it expands your feedback loop, your loops of reciprocity, from direct reciprocity to indirect reciprocity to ultimately infinite reciprocity. And so Karma Kitchen is actually a way where you said, look, what if I'm kind and I pay forward? So for those that don't know, Karma Kitchen is experiment, like a pop-up experiment at a restaurant where you walk in and you have a meal, but your check is zero, not because it's free, but because someone before you has paid for you and you are trusted to pay forward whatever you want out of gratitude for the person after you. Now, will that work? Will that not? Are people fundamentally greedy? Or can they find that space of generosity in themselves? And I think that's the question. And those kinds of experiments, the more we have those experiments, and Karma Kitchens have happened have occurred in, I think, 23 different countries. And so it's just a phenomenal way for people to challenge the dominant paradigm narrative, and to say, hey, maybe greed is good, as that famous, wasn't there that movie by Gordon Gekko, right, where he says greed is good, and maybe greed is good, but maybe generosity is better, right? And how do we? It starts with the story. It starts with these small experiences, and once we shift that, then we can manifest it in so many different ways. And so in a way, we're really trying to create a culture of generosity. And those systems of generosity look very, very different than those of, this transactional mindset of me versus you, only one of us can get ahead.
Well said. And why don't we shift from that, Nipun, to think a little bit about this current situation we're in. So much going on in the world right now. I don't want to make everything about COVID because, of course, there were so many other challenges. But I was intrigued when you shared with me where you were when the whole COVID situation emerged. And maybe you want to say a bit about that, because I think it must have given you a rather unique experience.
So yes, Mark and I were talking earlier, and I was saying I actually was in a 30-day meditation retreat in March when this whole, when the early thrust of this unfolded. And it was remarkable, right, to come out of that. Now, I did know during and even late February, people kind of had a feeling for it. But the extent of it and the kinds of transitions that society would have to make in a short period of time, all of that was dramatic. But one of the first signs was very interesting. So every day, I had zero physical social contact for all 30 days. And I'm sitting there at 8 p.m. every day. I'm meditating a fair amount, and all of a sudden I hear everybody just yelling. And this was a very quiet area, and I'm like, why is it? And they were like jubilant, like, yeah. And it turned out, I learned later that it was just a sort of neighborly practice to appreciate the frontline workers who couldn't actually be quarantined and were inside. And so 8 p.m. everyone came out to. And sitting there on a meditation cushion, I'm thinking, wow, like, even in times of such duress, at that time I didn't even know, but later when I was reflecting on it, even in times of such duress, right, like people find ways to say, hey, I'm still your neighbor, you can hear my voice, I'm going to yell out, and we're in solidarity with people who don't have the privilege of being quarantined even. And so, it was, that was remarkable. And I think the second big lesson for me was I was reading. I usually on a self retreat like this, I'll take a couple of books. And I had one of the books I had taken was a book by Ajahn Chah, who's this Thai Buddhist monk, an incredible guy. And at every point, like his common refrain was, "It's uncertain. Everything is uncertain. Are you enlightened? It's uncertain." And he says, anyone who says with certainty is probably not very clear on their awakening process. And I come out into this world and everything really is uncertain. And what that does for me is, I think sometimes we can get scared by change. But there's a beautiful quote by Thich Nhat Hanh. He says something like, let's see if I can get it right. He says, we don't suffer because things are impermanent. We suffer because we want them to be permanent. And to me, when I think of this uncertainty and change and impermanence, I ask myself, man, if this was your last hurrah, like what would you want to do? And for me, I always land at compassion. Like those trees. I don't know if you know about this, but this was a fascinating example. One of my friends is a farmer. And he called up my parents one day and he's like, there's this virus that's taken over the whole farm. All our thousands of trees are dying. And my mom says, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. She was heartbroken because she knew how much work they had put into it. And the farmer said something very interesting. The farmer, one of my very close friends as well. He said that, we learned a pretty incredible lesson that right before, so all the trees know that they're all going to die. But right before they start fruiting. And he says, we start seeing white flowers everywhere on our farm. And it was like, it was like the trees knew that this is our last chance. So what are we going to do? Let's give everything we got. We're not going to store anything. Let's just give it all out, and may these fruits continue, and spread the way they need to out in the world in the hands of nature. And so I look at impermanence. I look at uncertainty in that way and say, can I use this opportunity to reconnect with my compassion? And that's been my journey. And so it was a little surreal coming back into the world and
I'm sure.
seeing masks everywhere and lines, people social distancing at the grocery store. And and of course I knew that the suffering was going to be so unevenly spread in society. And so, you hold all that, but then you say, well, how can I hold the suffering with the greatest possible compassion I'm capable of?
And I know we're going to talk about some of the ways that we can build that compassion into our own lives, but I think you're touching on a really important point here about the situation. I mean, you mentioned the example of all the outpourings of gratitude to care workers and frontline workers and so on. And I think almost a universal response that I felt at the start of this crisis, in response to that uncertainty you're referring to, was one of sort of solidarity and kindness. And yet over time, as people's tolerance of risk, people's difference of opinion about the right way to handle the response, all that stuff emerges. What we're seeing, I think, is really a reenactment of a problem we've been seeing for some years across the Western world and around the world, of polarization. Sort of like one camp very much fear focused, and many of us wishing that we could be more focused on solidarity, togetherness, common humanity rather than fear of the other. Do you see those? How do you see those sort of two stories playing out?
Yeah, I think it's a very real question and a real edge. I think one of the questions early on we would ask, right, is this a war or is this a love story? And that's clearly we sometimes go in and attack and try to dominate the situation, and sometimes you have to, right? So I think in reality, most of us want to say that, yeah, there's a war element to it, and then there's a love story element to it too, but one gets covered up over the other. And I think the real edge underneath that question is, how do we respond? This edge between emergence and emergency. Right. Emergency is where you have to do something right now, right? You have to respond. You can't not respond. And that's a short feedback loop, versus emergence, which is trusting in the ripple effect. And so how do you learn to not have one overtake the other? If we're constantly in this fear mode, we're constantly in this emergency mode. And we have short-term feedback loops everywhere, right? I mean, even prior to the pandemic, everything is quick, here and now. Venture capitalists want their returns the next quarter, right? Politicians are looking at the next term. I mean, all of us, we look at the phone and we're refreshing our screens 2,700 times a day, So this is, that's the mentality we get in. And when we're just emergency all the time, we really lose touch with emergence. And not just touch with emergence, we lose the assets that emergence provides us. So I think there's a fear that, keeps you alive. And then there's a fear that keeps you from living. And how do we learn to differentiate between the two? So I'm not so sure it's either or, but it's about creating a wholesome balance that tilts towards greater emergence, because I think that's where love rises, right? Coronavirus taught us about the contagion effect. Right? Sorry, not Corona. Did I say Corona? I meant coronavirus.
COVID-19. Well, coronavirus is a project that you've launched in response to this crisis, isn't it? So we must, seeing as you've mentioned that accidentally, what does that involve?
Well, it actually came out, we launched it in March, and it came out of this need that the narrative that we see is so fear-driven, is so much entrenched in the emergency response, that we forget about the love element. We forget about the connection element. Even how we name social distancing, it's physical distancing. It's not social distancing. At 8 p.m., all those physically distanced neighbors that I was hearing are in solidarity and yelling, yeah, blowing their horns and saying, we're in this together. So where is that narrative? And how do we give rise to that narrative, those stories? And we felt like there was a huge shortage And so we launched this portal. It's called Karuna. Karuna is the Sanskrit word for compassion. It rhymed with, it kind of goes with Corona. So we're like, let's create a contagion of compassion. And let's presence these stories. And you saw some incredible stories. I actually have a few slides. Can I show them? Because I think it's very inspiring.
We'd love to see some of your stories of kindness and compassion, Nipun. Yes, please do.
That's awesome. I mean, and some of these you might have heard of straight away. I'll start with some in the UK, but this is Captain Moore. I mean, how incredible for a 99-year-old guy to just start out and say, I'm going to do laps in my backyard with my walker to raise money and awareness for the frontline nurses, right, that are risking their lives when there was very little known, right? And he became, of course, an icon that most of you know about, and so many millions of dollars. But more than that, his heart, just what a response of love. This is Miss England, who also happens to be a doctor. And she says, I'm gonna put all my beauty pageantry stuff on the side. I'm gonna recheck back in and become a doctor so I can volunteer. This is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, and she says, I'm gonna take a 20% pay cut. And so many people in our government did that, right? This was a remarkable story. This is in Ireland. So it turns out that back in 1870, there were these Native American tribes that said, oh, you guys are going through this great famine. Let us help you. And they sent them something like either $70 or $170, something in that range. And somebody in Ireland says, and it's true, the Navajo community in the US was actually one of the hardest hit by the pandemic. And they said, even if it's more than 100 years later, we would actually like to pay it forward what your community has done for us. And they set up this GoFundMe page. And I think something like $6 million from everyday people going from Ireland to the Navajo Nation, right? It was just very, very inspiring. But it wasn't just at these larger levels, right? It was also like a famous musician saying, I'm going to play in my front porch, and people would just come and listen. Instead of going to those big halls with, ticket prices, she's just doing it as a labor of love. I love this one. This is a kid that, it was a birthday, and what are you going to do? Like, no one can come home. So all the neighbors created this car rally. And this is her waving at them. And everyone is like honking their horns and telling her happy birthday. But what moved me even more was that she decided that she's actually going to create a whole a response team, a birthday response team. So any other kid in the community has a birthday, they will all like get in their cars and do a car rally, right? And lastly, I think I have one or two more slides here, but this is a woman who says, those who are deaf need to see your lips. So if everybody has a mask on, how am I gonna, how will they lip read? And so she designed herself this mask where you can actually see what the other person is saying, and that's just empathy. That's just care. That's just designing with a bigger heart. And so you saw this. This is, my wife is Sikh from the northern region of India, and for those that know, in Sikhism, you never cut your hair, and certainly you don't shave either. And so here was a devout Sikh who was a doctor in New York. But then all of a sudden he has to choose. He says, well, my religion also teaches me that I need to serve. So which is more important? And so he actually shaved because he felt it was his calling to be in service. In fact, they were twin brothers, and both of them ended up doing that. Here's an Italian priest who gave the ventilator that was due to him, and he says, I'm going to give it to a kid. So incredible. These stories go on. But here you have, this is in Israel, two paramedics after working with a 77-year-old, and both of them praying together, saying we're connected through this bond of service. and both of them doing their own different kinds of prayers together. And here's cops organizing. I mean, when do you see cops organizing their cop cars in, in a heart-shaped sort of thank you formation? So you just had like so many responses, and this was in the earlier days. But I feel like, and it's continued, and coronavirus sort of highlights these stories, but ultimately I think it's to balance this idea of emergence and emergency, that we do need to respond right away, but we also can't lose track of our greater humanity. That is clearly responding, but that perhaps the media is not sort of highlighting.
Thanks, Nipun. That's such a lovely set of examples. And in a moment, I'd love us to come on to talk a bit more about how we can put some of this into practice in our own lives, and perhaps what some of the implications are more widely for society. But why don't we pause there and perhaps take a chance to sort of involve the audience more? I think you had an idea of inviting people to sort of share some of their own ideas and thoughts at this point. How would you like to sort of frame that for the audience?
Yeah, I feel like it would be phenomenal if we just took a moment to connect with that part of us inside, because we've all probably heard an inspiring story or experienced it, or or just kind of something that warmed our hearts and renewed our faith in how amazing human beings are, how resilient we are. So if you could just take a moment to connect with that part of yourself, but also to maybe share in a sentence or two, or if you'd like to share a link, just share it in the chat window. So let's just take a moment to say, what has inspired you? What story of compassion has most deeply touched you in these times? And also keep an eye on how it is to view and read other people's stories, right? Like, what happens when you see like a dozen people responding and saying, this inspired me, it fills you up and it gives you hope, and you feel like, oh, I can do more of that. So that's sort of the practice. So maybe we take a minute to do that, Mark. Is that, you tell me the best process here.
That sounds great. So as people already seem to be doing, folks, if you'd like to share examples of things you've seen that have warmed your heart, examples of little acts of kindness, or big acts of kindness, whatever's on your mind, just so that the community can see those, but also we'll try and share some of those in this chat as well. I mean, I was really struck by the solidarity between neighbours in our community. People who, I mean, I'm blessed to live in a community where people generally know each other, but I have connections now with way more of people who live near me than I ever had when we were able to see each other fully face to face. And I just think that's a lovely example of sort of the human need for spontaneous sort of togetherness. And I know this varies across the country, and of course many people who are in need are still not getting the support they need. But just I mean, a really simple example was I enjoyed the opportunity when I went to the shops and others couldn't, to be able to fetch things for neighbours whose elderly father couldn't go out because he was shielding and so on. And and I'm not saying I'm some great saint or hero, but just the crisis created that opportunity to think of others and to do little things. So let's just look at some of the lovely examples that are coming up. Actually, a few people are noting how much they appreciated your distinction between social distancing and physical distancing, because we definitely need the physical distancing. We definitely don't need the social distancing. This is all about connection. I can hardly sort of read these because they're flying past so fast, but let me see if I can see a few. Yeah, so people talking about WhatsApp groups with neighbours. Yeah, someone providing a free laughter sessions for school children, cooking food for frontline workers, organising food donations. Someone's auntie donated their kidney to someone. Cancer support in the community. People leaving books outside doors in their village, offering services to frontline staff. I mean, I'm blown away by the sheer breadth and scale of these responses that are coming up now. So
it actually might be awesome, Mark, post call, if you could just archive these and mirror them back to the whole community, because
we always do actually, Nipun, but this will certainly be the richest chat so far in terms of having all this content. So we'll certainly be sharing this in the follow-up email that goes to everyone tomorrow. And equally, if you have other resources like the coronavirus website, we can include that in the follow-up as well, because I know people will want to be involved. And yeah, I mean, David just made a nice
Let me,
point there about just saying hello to people. I saw this so much that even though we were being asked to sort of be respectful and keep our distance, people are almost going out of their way more to make eye contact and say hello, even though they're sort of crossing the road physically. And I think that's, yeah, it's a really lovely example of how we can show that social distancing while still physically disconnected.
yeah.
Have any caught your eye on the chat there? Have you seen any fly past that have caught your eye?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I'm trying not to look at the chat because I'll be so distracted, but you know, the clapping for the NHS, that kind of thing where I think early on when people would just get in their balconies and sing and they were like, man, this pandemic's got nothing on me, you know, and then the whole neighborhood would start singing together. I mean, there's something so heartwarming about that, you know. And I will just add that it's, to me, like I said, actually, like reading all this stuff, it's, you just realize that, wow, like there is so much goodness, and this is not present if you're just reading the news, right? There was actually research in the UK. This is a couple of years old, but I would bet that this is even more so true now than ever before. They asked people that, you know, how many of you believe in pro-social compassionate values, right? And 74% said yes. And then they asked them, how many of you think other people believe in these values? 23%. So in truth, 74% care for these values, but we have this major gap because we think actually only 23% care, right? And why is that? And that's the problem of narrative. And I think just even that simple exercise of everyone just sharing and you realizing, wow, there's dozens of ways, as Rumi would say, to kneel and kiss the ground, right? To share compassion and kindness with each other. I think as soon as you see that, it reconnects you and you says, wow, no, actually 74% of the people do care, do not just care. I would say everybody cares, but I would say 74% want to lead with those values.
Mm. And that, I think, shows a disconnect between the reality of human nature, which is generally to crave togetherness, belonging, support, and connection, and a media narrative that, you know, gets a buzz from creating a sense of difference and fear and so on. And that's where I think our individual behaviour can really make a difference. So I'm still seeing so many inspiring examples of kindness appear. But you also talk really beautifully, Nipun, about how this being generous, living a kind life doesn't just affect the others around us, it kind of can lead to a sort of transformation for us ourselves. Would you like to say a bit more about that and why that matters?
Yeah. I think there's, all of us know, and we kind of say this, right, that every act creates a ripple effect. And we kind of understand that, but we minimize that. So I think there's two kinds of ripple effects. One is an external ripple effect, and another is an internal ripple effect. And we tend to overlook the internal altogether, and we tend to minimize the external. But it's actually so very powerful. I think you know about the smile cards, right? That we used to, we had this small experiment, and it's gone out to millions of people. Now in the pandemic, it's a little bit different now. But you do a small act and you leave a smile card behind. And it tells the person you can't pay back, but please keep the chain going and pay forward. Now you look at that and you can say, well, that's sweet. How is that going to solve the problems of the world? But what we don't look at is the depth of what happens through those small acts. So we had a woman that wrote to us. This is maybe 2 years ago or so. And this really touched my heart. I mean, so this woman says, look, I didn't know too much about kindness. I didn't know anything about smile cards. My son was out camping and he was on a top of a cliff. He slipped and he fell and he passed away. And he says, this tragedy that I don't know if I could ever recover from. But the police then gave me all the belongings that he had on him, including his wallet. And inside his wallet was a smile card. I looked at that smile card and I said, wow, my son believes in kindness. And I went to the site and I said, wow, what can I do in my time of such deep grieving? How can I reconnect with my son's heart? And she says, I decided that for the whole next year, I'm going to do a unique act every single day to honor my son. And I mean, how do you capture the effect of that, right? Is that small? Is that big? Is that like, something that goes on for so long? I mean, she did this and she just sent us an email. Now I'm sharing this with you. It's touched my life. Maybe it's touching some of your lives, and you will pay it forward. Like, how do you actually measure all that, right? So that's the external effect. But there's also a very profound internal ripple effect that we almost always overlook. When we go from me to we, there is something that happens on the outside, and that's of course very meaningful, but there's also something that changes inside of us, right? We are putting the brakes on our egos. Like 24 hours a day, our sensations are telling us me first, me first, me first. And through that small act, it's a revolutionary act for our inner ecologies. We're putting the brakes on the me and saying the we matters. And as we do that, our minds quiet down. And as our minds quiet down, we fall into an interconnection. We feel satisfied. We feel happy, right? Actions for happiness. And now there's a lot of neuroscience around what actually happens. Dopamine releases and all these endorphins release, and serotonin and oxytocin, and you can get into the neuroscience of it as well. But what it fundamentally does when your mind quiets and you fall into an interconnection is that you're naturally compassionate. And then I think there's this beautiful Rachel Naomi Remen quote. It says, when we help, you see life as broken. When you help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life as broken. When you serve, you see life as a co-creative whole. And that happens as we quiet our minds and start to see the interconnection, and we respond from that place of interconnection. It actually starts to change the way in which we give. It starts to change the way in which we create, even dramatic change in the world. So I think generosity is an incredible lever to transform ourselves.
So Nipun, as you know, and many of the audience know, we have these monthly themes and these action calendars in the Action Happiness community that millions of people are using, with these slightly painful alliterating thematic titles. So last month was Altruistic August.
I like that.
We're now in Self-Care September, and I love that sort of interplay between altruism and self-care. In many ways, that's the essence of the combined strength that we're trying to build in the Action Happiness community. And on that subject of self-care, we had Krista Neff with us on one of these chats not so long ago, who says famously, you can't pour from an empty cup. So whilst you've shown us the great power that comes from helping others, the enrichment that brings to us, as well as the people we're helping, why the world needs this so much, I feel that we can only really do that if we're also kind to ourselves. And in fact, many people who are doing unkind things are doing so because their own well-being is under pressure. They're in a state of fight or flight. So talk to us a little bit about self-care and how that connects with your belief in the power of generosity.
Yeah, I think self-care is very critical. Gandhi used to say that what we see on the outside mirrors our inner ecology, right? So how we treat ourselves is actually how we're going to treat other people. If we're not kind to ourselves, it's going to be very hard to be kind to other people. So I think fundamentally there is this edge between self-care and self-sacrifice. And when you see that the benefit to other people, the benefit to other people clearly has to be greater than the cost to us. If the cost to us is so high and the benefit is very little, it's not a smart thing to do. And to put it another way, right? Think of it, I always use this example. If you're trying to build one bridge, but in the process, you're burning two bridges, or even if the other way, right? If you're building three bridges, but burning one along the way, that's not the smartest thing to do either, right? So how do we learn to include ourselves and not just ourselves? If you nuance that a little bit more, so many unresolved, unintegrated parts of ourselves that maybe there's great parts of ourselves, but how do I integrate so many other parts of myself with the same kind of care and compassion that I wish to serve others with? And I think that's very critical. So I'm glad you had Self-Care September. I've got my own sort of practices. I'm sure you do too, Mark. I mean, this is not my time to interview you, but I think we all need to pay attention to tuning and nurturing the instrument through which we serve.
Well said. Thank you. So, folks, we're going to move towards taking questions from the audience in a moment. So do take this chance to put some questions to Nipun, and then he'll come back with another little challenge for us. It's been so lovely to see all those responses to the idea of inspiring stories. I think they're still popping up on the screen even now. So I'm looking forward to reading those afterwards in a quieter moment. Nipun, we've had one comment from someone in response who was referring to you're mentioning all these lovely acts of kindness and saying that they seem to have gone away, particularly in the US, in this person's view, perhaps because of some of the other things going on, particularly Black Lives Matter and the protests and potentially some of the divisive political stuff happening in the US. The US is obviously a particular situation, but I think to some extent there are worries about issues, whether it's the broader issue of systemic racism or the existential crisis around the climate, the sort of growing inequality we face. So there are these sort of structural problems that although we can be the change and make these ripples around us, we desperately want to see the systems change as well. How would you respond to that? Because I think it's a really valid challenge actually that it's not an either or, personal change and the little ripples are hugely important, but how can we push for a world that is systemically different as well?
Yeah, I think that's a very real question, and I think it's something like even today, like this is something I'm looking at. I've got the lights on. It's 11:30 a.m. Like it is dark outside. 2 days ago, it was over 100 degrees here. Like this is I've never in all my years here in Northern California, I've never seen this. None of us have. Like it's just this weird color of in the sky. We have fires going on. We had 100-degree weather. Now we need a jacket today. Like what's going on? And that's just at that one very micro level. But you can start to look at so many challenges and so much oppression, so much unfairness. And it really starts to beg the question, like, how do we respond? And not just in an emergency way, because a lot of these things require much more of a systemic response, right? I think today, Forbes, I just read a headline that said America's 400 richest people, they actually gained incredible wealth, like hundreds of billions of dollars, like over the pandemic times. And they're worth 3.2 trillion, right? So clearly, like, stocks are riding high, unemployment is now back down again, and yet like we're all feeling, as the New York Times headline read, gross domestic misery. So GDP is going up, but our well-being is not. So how do we lead our systems with with a different set of organizing principles altogether? And I sense that at the core of this question, and each of these issues that you mentioned, you can go very deep into it. Even Black Lives Matter, my friend and a really well-respected civil rights leader, John Powell, speaks about this. He says we have to move from othering to belonging. And belonging is not saming, right? It's just that instead of finding safety in building barriers, how do we find safety in building bridges that actually, and there is a kind of safety, but it's a different kind of safety. It's a different kind of orientation. It requires different kinds of systems. So how do we start to do and circulate a very different pattern of systemic change? And I think at its core, it is inviting us it is a call for a different kind of leadership. And we think of this, and we actually can't, there's no word to describe the nuances of this, so we made one up, right? And Mark, I think I might have mentioned this to you earlier one time, I don't know, but we call it laddership. Where if leadership is about leading from the front, laddership is a very different way to hold the whole. Frederick Laloux actually has done some interesting work, and in a nutshell, what he shares is he says we used to organize as wolf packs, like just reacting, just gangs. I disagree with you, bring out your gun and take them down. Then we started to go into army mode, right? Like plan and execute. Then we organized as machines, which is the modern day corporations, interchangeable parts. Then we got into more, and now you see some of this, which is more family oriented, which is leading with values and purpose. But he says ultimately, and I think he's right, how do we learn to create systems that are rooted in a living systems approach, right? Like where everything is connected to everyone else. And what is leadership? Like the Army kind of leadership is not the kind of leadership that living systems require. So how do you ladder the whole? How do you move from planning and executing to searching and amplifying? These are all very different traits that we're not teaching our leaders. So I would say that at its core, it requires this kind of laddership, and laddership requires a very different understanding, a very different value system to lead with. And so I really think, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. You know, I mean, we can't do it possibly in a couple minute response, but I think it's very important to really hold these questions and invite these questions. Otherwise, it's not generous happiness. It can be very narcissistic happiness.
Well, I think even though we haven't gone into that in huge detail, that's a really helpful perspective to share. And we've also had some really helpful responses to what you're saying from the community as well. So Benita said, I'm an American. Don't be fooled by the headlines. We actually have so many amazing, selfless people. There's a point, you're reinforcing your point earlier, that we're looking at the world often through the lens of a media perspective, which is sort of, if 0 is reality, +5 is utopia, and -5 is it's all gone to hell in a handcart, we should be seeing the world as 0, where we're getting a blended mix of what's really going on. And we tend to see a -3 view or -4 view because that's what the media focuses on. But Crystal also made a good point, which was that she feels people are, assuming I've got the name correct there, that I think we're now more open to Black Lives Matter and other social movements, perhaps because we're learning how to be kind to each other more. It's almost that this feeling of anger and eruption, whilst I think really strong and powerful and visceral and right, is also, I think, the point being made is an example of us waking up to the need to care more for each other, to be more aware and tolerant, to be more addressing inequality and systemic issues. And I think that's a very hopeful way. It's really quite anger-filled time in many ways.
Yeah. And I think on the whole, a lot of people, my cousin who's in college sent out a note to the whole family. And I can't imagine her sending this out. And she says, guys, everyone has to go out there and vote. And this kind of, like, I think the younger generation is also feeling this impulse for engagement. And I think that's probably the most, inspiring response to these ills, is to say, go out and be engaged. Like, there's a beautiful quote, I forget by who, but it says, where does your deepest gladness meet the hunger of the world? And so I think each one of us is called, if we try to be all things to all people, we'll burn out. It's too much. It feels overwhelming. But at the same time, you're going to be moved by certain issues, by certain situations. And I think it's imperative that we act on it with the heart of service, and with the heart of, as John Powell says, to build bridges across what doesn't seem like you. And I think that's definitely the call of the hour around the world, across the issues, to not just find safety in closing down, but to actually realize that in opening up, we create a very different kind of possibility. We create a different kind of collective intelligence. We create a different experience for ourselves and for other people.
Thank you. So let's come to some more of these great questions coming in. And for some people, they may want to really help others and show kindness and generosity and compassion, but they may be struggling themselves. We're all under lots of pressure. Sue's asked a really profound question. She says, is it too late? I feel I haven't really helped in the current crisis. I've just kept myself and my family safe. I feel guilty that I could have given so much more from my privileged position. What words of advice might you give to someone like Sue, who hasn't had the chance to do as much as she perhaps would have liked to?
I would say start now. It's better now than tomorrow. So I would say, forget about the chances you might have lost, but like the fact that you're asking that question now And there are many others like you who perhaps, you know, a month from now will say, oh, why did I waste that whole month? So don't waste it now. Like, go out and do something small. My advice would be, don't wait for that grand thing. Like, see what makes your heart glad. You will know exactly where you need to fill, what part of the spectrum of suffering in the world you are called to serve. And don't think big. I think that would be my biggest thing. Like, don't wait for the perfect circumstances, for the perfect, situation to sort of align. Just go out and do something small. You know, someone wrote to me the other day. They went on Amazon and went to their baby registry or something and went anonymously, like, you know, filled up one or two things on the baby registry. Right? Yeah. If you have a little extra money, you could do that. Or if you'd like to give your time, you know, volunteer. There's so many phone banks. People are so lonely. Like, just listening is an incredible act of service. You know, pick up a lot of young people early on in the pandemic, especially, were picking up groceries for the elders. So in this time of physical distancing, how can we use the skills that we do have and circulate that love? So I would say do it today. Doesn't
Start
matter
now.
what you
Never
did
too
yesterday
late.
or not, and think small.
Thank you. So it's often easy to be kind to the people who are being kind to us, or who, you know, we care about. But Marling has asked an interesting question: how do I act with generosity to people who are damaging to others? How can we keep that sense of kindness when the way that others are behaving perhaps isn't very kind?
Yeah, yeah, it's true. And it's a very legitimate kind of thing. And I think for me, you know, I had this one very teaching moment when someone gave me, I was in India and someone gave me some sweets. I was carrying them in the car and I was going in a cab and I was going from one place to another. Traffic comes to a halt. Someone knocks on my window. It's this monastic looking guy and he's asking for money. And I said, you know, instead of money, can I give you this sweet? And it was something I loved, right? So I was sharing something I really loved, and I gave it. He took it, and the traffic eased up, so our car's moving forward. I look back to see how he's enjoying it, right? Like, maybe it's not super selfless. I probably wanted to see the reaction, and I'm looking, I'm saying, and you know what he did? He threw it away. And I was so heartbroken initially. I was like, man, I gave you this thing that I loved and you threw it away, right? And then it occurred to me, after I calmed down a little bit, it occurred to me that actually that wasn't my sweets. It was something that someone else had given me, and it wasn't even, you know, and maybe it didn't go to him, but maybe he threw it on the ground and it went to the ants on the ground. So the equation wasn't between me and that monk. The equation was on the person who gave me the sweets and the ants on the ground. I made it about me. And so in that sense, I think what that taught me is, like that famous saying goes, right? Hurt people, and healed people, heal people. So if someone is hurting me or saying harmful things or taking advantage even of my generosity, it really helps. Of course, you need to have healthy boundaries, but it also really helps to frame it in your head as it's not a personal thing, right? It's that maybe someone has taken from them and they are taking from others because they haven't seen that kind of generosity. So do I have it? If I have done enough self-care, if I'm in a strong place in myself and I'm in a position to give in that moment, can I build a bridge, right? Not just with that person, but with the lineage of those conditions. And if I can do that, then perhaps I'm maybe in that situation, it's not even necessarily going to feel good. So it may not be happy in the short term, but it'll be generous. And as that's generous, it will create the seeds of happiness for the future interaction that they do have. So I think it's a very real thing that you encounter all the time. But I think it's an invitation to broaden our frame and to see if we're, you know, if we need to say not now, or if we are in a stable place in ourselves to say, okay, now is a good time for me to build that bridge, and then do it with that big heart.
Thank you, Nipun. Let's move on to some more sort of quick fire that hopefully can just give us a sort of spontaneous answer to. So Katie said, can you recommend a small act of kindness that I can try to do every day, no matter how busy I am that day?
Yes, take out the, do dishes for your, for your loved ones at home, right? That's something you can do. And it sounds trivial. You're like, oh, this person doesn't need it, but it's not for that person. It creates an inner ripple effect in you. I do stuff for my wife all the time, even when it's not for me to do. So I would say start at home.
Start at home, lovely. Judy says, could you ask Nipun what practical things he does every day to stay positive or when he's feeling a bit down? How do you give yourself that boost to keep wanting to help others?
I think I would say two things. One is meditation. That really helps me because it really quiets the mind and you realize that you are not your thoughts. And the second is this idea of noble friends. And that if you have this kindred spirits that share your values, then it really gives you so much resilience. So I don't feel like, oh, it's my thing. This situation has got me down. All of it might have gotten me down. But because I have, this web of friendships with other people who care for the same values, then all of a sudden I feel held by that. So I would say meditation and noble friends, which are born of small acts of service.
Emma has asked, if we do kind acts and we serve generously, but with the intention of feeling good about it, is that true kindness or is that just a form of selfishness?
You can nuance that in so many different ways. So I would say not to get intellectual about it, but just to observe, what is actually true kindness? And if there was such a thing as true kindness, would we ever even know? So the fact that we're even trying to analyze it already is a bit problematic. So I would say stop with that kind of intellectualization and just observe that, oh, I did this small act. I broke this small bridge between me and we. Now I'm in a greater greater space of we, and that feels good. Now, is that a zero-sum game? Is that if I feel good, that means the other person doesn't feel good? Or is that a regenerative thing, right? And that, oh, I feel good and now I have more to give. And that person actually has gratitude and it comes back to me and I feel like, and that nourishes my resilience and I'm able to give more. And is that what happens? What happens? So I would say just observe, see what happens. Keep experimenting with kindness and with a lens on what's actually happening inside you.
Thank you. There are so many lovely questions and observations coming in, but I know you wanted to sort of put another challenge to the community and get some more feedback from people. But I just wanted to sort of leave the questions with this one from Paula, who says she teaches in an all-girls school for age 11 to 18, sort of teenage group. What would your main message be to young people in today's modern world? I'll pass it on to them tomorrow, she says. So, I mean, this is a really interesting challenge because, of course, so many positive things, I think, in the next generation. And yet it's really challenging times for young people, the pressure on them, I mean, especially the way that lives are being constrained at the moment for many. What would be your message to the next generation, Nipu?
I would say that look at the edges, nuance the virtues that you stand for. So I think this is something we do in leadership, right? Like, so if you think grit is an amazing thing, think about surrender. Like, what's the value of surrender? If you're all into surrender, think about grit. If you love self-sacrifice and service, think about self-care. If you're about self-care, how do you start, like similarly, humility and conviction, safety and vulnerability, content and context, right? Form and formless. Like you can keep going with these things like serendipity and structure, and to not just to sort of hold the gray zone in between these extremes, right? To actually find a dynamic middle path. There's no prescriptive, this is the middle. It's that middle is always shifting based on the two ends that we have. So I would say be the change, do the small acts, but as you're being the change, keep an eye on your understanding of virtue and your understanding of the middle path of that virtue and how that is continuing to change. And I think in that way, not only will we create an external ripple effect, but we will create a much more nuanced understanding of what these virtues mean to us. And I think the more people that are alive in that way, the stronger the stronger the possibilities for the future. So keep
Very
going,
good.
young people.
So I think that's a message for all of us, not just young people, in fact. So on that idea of being the change, I know you wanted to leave one last sort of challenge or question to the community. So how would you like to frame that?
Well, and that actually dovetails nicely from that question, which is that and here's a question to all of you, that, what change would you like to be in the world? Gandhi famously said, or he didn't say, he implied it, this is a paraphrase, but you must be the change you wish to see in the world. But what kind of change do you wish to be? What is one small act that you can do today that you'd like to do? And you would be amazed that by merely just presencing it, and presencing it even in a community, especially presencing it in a community of like-minded people, even if you don't have physical contact with them, there is a kind of strength that comes from that. And so the invitation, maybe take a minute or so to write down in the chat window, what change would you like to be in the world? And if you'd like to be specific, that's even better. What is that one specific action that you'd like to take in service to the change you want to see in the world?
Well, mine, Nipun, is, I think, to try and emulate some of what you do, which is to be an enabler of helping others to see how their happiness is connected to helping bring happiness to others. That's really the mission with Actual Happiness. That's what I spend my hours and days trying to encourage. And it's lovely already to see, people saying, everyone have patience, find less ego, to be more understanding, to help contribute to a fair world, better education, be compassionate, listen with kindness, non-judgment. I want to be a connector, listen mindfully, and so they continue. So thank you, folks. Please do keep showing those. That's just really see all that.
Doesn't that mark it? Doesn't that fill your heart? I feel like just bowing to all of them and their small acts. I mean, it doesn't mean we're perfect and glorious saints in all parts of ourselves, but that part of us is so alive, right? That wants to be in service, that wants to be compassionate, that wants to observe the phenomena that we call as and so it completely fills my heart, actually. So I feel grateful that this has happened under my watch. I want to read the chat window afterwards, if you can share it with me.
We will certainly share the chat window afterwards, Nipun, and we'll share a link to your wonderful coronavirus work, your own website. People have been asking if there's more information about laddership as well. So if you could share a link about laddership, we'd love to share that with the community too. We're unfortunately out of time, although I can see we're still getting a chat full of wonderful being the change. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with, Nipun?
I do. I've got a photo that I want to show you that totally gave me the goosebumps the first time I saw it. Can I show it real quick here?
Please.
Let me see here. So there was this photographer that a German photographer. Oh, is this it? Yeah, here it is. A German photographer was just taking these photos, and he didn't even realize he captured this. He was actually in Spain at the time, and he's clicking. All of a sudden, he sees, oh my God, that's a giant murmuration of sterlings. You have hundreds of these birds that came together in this unique formation, creating another bird. So they were threatened by something, they were threatened by a predator, and in response, they said, we need to do something about it. And in 10 seconds, they all just came together with this collective intelligence, and they created this incredible bird formation. And in another 10 seconds, it was completely dissolved. So much so that the photographer didn't even notice that he had taken this epic photo. It was, I think it was runner-up for Photo of the Year last year. And I think this is the possibility, that when we are kind, we are compassionate, it feels like we may be doing something small, but we are actually instruments of a much larger intelligence. And maybe that one bird in that formation doesn't quite know exactly, oh, what exactly am I doing? But collectively it's making an incredible effect. So I would say go out and do that small act, and let's ignite these incredible formations of compassion and love. Thank you, Mark.
Well said. That's so powerful, and that image is a lovely example of small acts together making a really a big difference. Nipun, it's been an absolute joy being with you this evening. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. All the amazing comments and ideas and all the gratitude that's appearing now on the chat as well. We'll share all of this with everyone who's been here. Nipun, keep up the inspiring work. Thank you for encouraging us all to be more generous. It's a joy to see you, and very grateful.
Thank you. Thank you. I wish I could give you all a physical hug, but I will do it in my heart. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely evening, and we'll see you again really soon.